can complain. Something that makes your confidence steal. No mystery that the music tells a story of the future that's born of the beauty and the majesty that life on earth is meant to be. Talk about the government. Wrote a words about political favor. Everything touches like political choice. The life you take is your political voice. The sacred cows come crashing to her knees. And all this street without intelligence. There's no choice between the heavens and the seas in a bloodbath. That furry piece of golden cow. There's a million life round everything true. You slaughter from your feast, disrespect the beast. Think of it tonight and take your chance.
Hello everybody, this is Katya, and I welcome you this evening to my video channel. I wanted to play a song by Chrissie Hynde and the Pretenders, Waste Not, Want Not. That's from Pretenders 2. So I was in kind of a Pretenders mood this evening and wanted to share with you one of my favorite tracks by them. One thing I find about the Pretenders is that there's a kind of clarity in their music that I think lends itself to careful thinking and philosophy. So this evening, what I would like to do in the rest of my video is mention another issue that comes out of the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche in his work that I've discussed a little bit before called Morgenröte, or the Dawn. So what I want to say something about a little bit tonight, again by way of exposure to philosophical methodology and the way philosophy gets done, is something about Nietzsche's account of what we would call rights and duties. So people, we believe, have certain rights and they also have certain duties. Or in German there's a Pflicht und Recht, duty and right. So what I want to talk about is Nietzsche's account of that, and then a certain problem I see with it, and then I'll conclude with sort of a general comment in reflection about this aspect of this philosophy. So basically, rights and duties are sort of complementary. So if I have a right to something, like if I have a right to, let's say, freedom of speech, then that means that other people have a duty to respect my right. And when I have a duty, that means that I have a duty to respect their rights in the same way. So their right to freedom of speech would mean that I have a duty to respect that. And similarly, my right to freedom of speech would impose upon them a duty to respect my right. And that would be the case for whatever right and duty we're talking about, but they come along in pairs. They're sort of complementary notions. Now, Nietzsche gives a very interesting account of how he thinks the practice of ascribing rights and duties to people came to be in our society, and really what is really the rationale of this practice, of this activity of ascribing rights and duties to each other. So he tells the following story. And what I'm going to do is summarize it very briefly, and then I'm going to say what I think is a problem with it. And then I'll conclude with a general remark. So I think here's basically the idea behind Nietzsche's account of rights and duties. He thinks that whenever there are rights and duties that people have with respect to one another, that's because the people are already standing in some kind of relationship where they're more or less just as powerful as one another. In other words, the people have basically the same amount of power, and so they're kind of trying to figure out how to work out these power relations between each other. So when somebody gives certain rights to me, or allows me to have certain rights, Nietzsche says, that means that the person sees that, well, I'm more or less as powerful as that person is, and that person then wants to give me certain rights because it might be advantageous to that other person to give me those rights. For example, if down the road that other person finds himself or herself in conflict with somebody else, then that person can come back to me and say, well, look, I've given you these rights. That was sort of a gift, a kind of a way of my respecting you, and maybe also supporting you and giving you a certain measure of security, and now I expect you to reciprocate by helping me in this problem that I'm having with somebody else, with a third party. So that's how the right part of it works. And then as far as my duty if I have a duty to somebody else, then that, in a way, that's my way of reciprocating according to Nietzsche. That's my way of saying, well, look, I'm also going to respect that person's rights because that gives me a way of sort of gaining a little bit of power back. In other words, the person has agreed to acknowledge my rights, and so if I say, well, I'm going to do the same thing for you, and I'm going to do that out of my own volition, I'm going to choose to do that, well, then that would be an authoritative decision by me that Nietzsche thinks gives me a little bit more power back because, after all, the other person has already granted me rights, so that puts me at a little bit of a disadvantage. But then if I say, well, look, I will give you certain rights and then hold myself duty-bound to respect them, then that brings a little bit of my self-respect, my self-power back. And so once again, the basic idea here is that we have more or less equality of power relationships between the people who ascribe rights and duties to each other. Nietzsche goes on to say that when that equivalence or that balance gets disturbed so that one person has a lot of power and the other person doesn't, then the whole practice of rights and duties seems to no longer apply because nobody needs anything. The powerful person doesn't need anything from the weaker person, and the weaker person can't do anything about it. So the whole practice begins to shrivel up, and it doesn't really have any application anymore. So in a nutshell, that's Nietzsche's view of how rights and duties, Rechte und Pflichten, come to have an application in our human practices. Now, here's the problem that I see with this account. It's a very simple problem. And it could be put the following way as sort of a counterexample. There are many people or creatures to whom I feel obligated. I give them certain rights, and I feel like I have certain duties then to respect their rights, even though those people are not in any kind of equivalent power relationship with me. So let's take a very clear example. If I'm a parent and I have an infant or a very small child who's weak, has not grown, that creature does not have the same level of power that I do, and yet I would nevertheless feel the duty a duty to respect that person's rights. That person or that creature has a right to be cared for, to have certain minimal standards of health, or just basically being fed and clothed and protected from illness and protected from predators, things of that nature. I would feel that that person, that very weak creature, has the right to expect those things, and I'm duty bound to respect those rights. Now, Nietzsche might say something like, well, look, basically it's the same old play, though, because down the road, I'm expecting this creature to grow up and maybe become an adult and take care of me or something like that. But that doesn't really ring true, because even in the case of creatures that we know are not going to make it to adulthood, maybe there's a severely disabled child or a baby who has a very rare disease that will prevent the baby from reaching the adulthood and being in a position of comparable power to me and other adults, we still feel that we have a duty to respect those creatures. They have certain basic fundamental rights. We may disagree about exactly what they are, but certainly they have a right to be taken care of, to be fed, to be nurtured to the extent that we can. And so that imposes a duty on us, even though we are overwhelmingly more powerful than those creatures, and in many cases, certainly, that might not change. In other words, the creature might not gain power, and yet we still feel that we are obligated to respect its rights and that we are duty-bound to do that. I suppose Nietzsche could say, well, these are weak people, and sometimes in some of his darker moods, he does seem to suggest that, well, look, only the strong should be taken seriously. I'm not saying that he's always in that vein, but sometimes he says that. But I think that if the point is to try to explain our ordinary practice of ascribing rights and duties to one another, there's a serious gap or a serious lacuna in what Nietzsche is saying, because we do feel that certain beings who are significantly weaker than we are and who may remain so for the duration of their lives, nevertheless have certain basic rights that impose certain basic duties on the rest of us, even if we don't have any reasonable expectation of getting something from them down the road, that we could somehow, once they become powerful enough, we could draw them into an alliance or something like that. So I think the problem with Nietzsche here is that it doesn't really do justice to our everyday practice of attributing rights and duties to each other. That's a problem. And I don't think he has a very good answer to that. Now, let me conclude the video by saying something about Nietzsche's philosophy in general, and sort of how this way of thinking strikes me sometimes, not all the time, and I certainly don't want to be dismissive, but I think it's important to say this. I remember when I was growing up, I lived in a very rural part of the country, and sometimes I would go out into the mountains. I've often used these settings, forests and mountains, in a lot of the stories that I tell, because that's what I grew up with and that's what I know. So I remember there was one mountain that I used to go to that was the highest mountain in the area, and on the top of it, it was very beautiful in the summertime. It's a place where you could go, and you had this magnificent view. You could see all these things. You had sort of a bird's eye view on everything, and you also felt like it was almost like you were a god or something like that. You were very detached and very removed from the rest of human civilization, because the top of that mountain was very sparsely populated. There was almost nobody else there. And yet you had this beautiful vista. You had these flowers, trees, and all the rest of it in the summertime. So you could live there, and you could see yourself, envision yourself building an entire life there during that time in the summer when everything was ideal. But it really isn't feasible. It really doesn't work when it starts to get cold. It really doesn't work when inclement weather sets in, snow or heavy rain, or you find yourself without any power because the electricity doesn't run up there and you can't get anywhere to get food or something like that. And so it can be deceptive. In other words, when you go there in ideal weather, under ideal conditions, you can very easily imagine living there your entire life and building an entire existence there, but it really doesn't make sense, because when more difficult things come along, that's not going to be feasible. Now, I think that sometimes with Nietzsche's philosophy, there's a similar intellectual problem, which is when you read these things, some of these passages, when you take them in isolation and you say, oh, that's brilliant, it's wonderful, I can see somebody trying to build an entire philosophy from this without God, without ethics, without morals, because Nietzsche thinks that those are simply constructs that we project. It's a very fancy fictional story that we told ourselves, but it doesn't really have anything to do with reality. That's why he refers to morals or ethics as idols. And so the Guts and Down, The Twilight of the Idols, that's one of his famous works, he relegates all of that to the trash bin. And when you read that in isolation, sometimes that can seem very convincing. But when you start to think about it, and when you start to put it into context with other things, like I've tried to do a little bit this evening, then things don't really make a lot of sense, or the cracks begin to show, the fissures begin to show, it begins to sort of look like a leaky boat. It doesn't really make sense. So that's not to dismiss everything that he says, but it is to say that we need to be careful and critical. So I just wanted to share that with you because listening to the Pretenders put me into a kind of serious mood, and then I started thinking a little bit about some of the philosophy I've been doing recently. So that's basically all I had to say. I hope you enjoyed it, and certainly if anybody has any questions or comments, I would be happy to address them to the extent that I'm able, but I do want to thank everybody for watching my videos again, and for your very kind comments. I appreciate that. And so until next time, this is Katja Eckhart, wishing everybody a safe and restful good night, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.